This is Josh Cunnings coming to you this evening from UC Berkeley, actually, the Berkeley Institute of East Asian Studies, where I'm talking with Ayumi Kinezuka. Pleasure to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Thank you.
Ayumi, you're a farmer, correct?
Yes. I'm an organic tea farmer.
Organic tea farmer. How many acres of tea do you farm in Japan?
We have 5 acres.
You do farm in Japan, correct? In Fukushima Prefecture?
No, not in Fukushima. I'm a farmer in Shizuoka Prefecture, which is 270 miles away from Fukushima.
About 270 miles. That's about, what, 400 kilometers?
Yes, about 400 kilometers.
And in your area, you've conducted radiation tests and so on, and the tea is safe to consume, correct?
No, unfortunately, the tea produced last year was contaminated from the radiation because the radioactivity particle flew from Fukushima all the way to my farm, and it contaminated our tea, unfortunately. So we tested all our tea. So we have 3 harvest seasons, and all our harvested tea throughout the season, throughout the year, were contaminated. Of course, the contamination level was different. So the first harvest season in end of April, that was most contaminated. We detected 350 becquerel.
At the end of April, you mean immediately following 3/11?
Yes.
And would you attribute that to the plume, the massive release into the atmosphere that occurred in the initial meltdown?
Yes, we suspect that.
And how many kilometers out has it affected that area of farming?
What do you mean? I didn't understand.
How far out has the immediate fallout that occurred after 3/11 by the end of April, how far away is it still making it unsuitable to cultivate crops?
You can't just say how many, because the contamination level varies in each area depending on which direction the wind blew and also which timing the rainfall occurred. And so certain area that's even farther than our place is more contaminated than my farm. So we have to test each crops every time. So we cannot just generally say I live in Shizuoka and all the tea are the same level. So every tea must be measured to be certain how much it is contaminated.
Who is doing the testing? Which governmental agency is performing the tests?
So it's not by the government. It's unfortunate the government is not really willing to test all the products in Japan. So it started as a voluntary from the farmers' side. After we found in Kanagawa Prefecture there was a high contamination in the tea. So we decided to test all our tea.
So if a farmer volunteers information that is incorrect, the government will allow that tea or that rice or any other crop to be sold. Is that correct?
Yes, so the government has a regulation level for the safety. And if it is below that regulation level, they say we can claim the product is safe. So that is what's happening in Japan.
But who is actually enforcing the regulation? Who is actually doing the testing and telling the government what the levels are?
The testing is not really done into all the products. So, for example, the farming agricultural cooperative, they do the sampling and they test only a small amount of the whole products. And if the high amount of radiation is found, the government enforces, of course, not to distribute these products. But most of the time, the testing is not adequately done. So a lot of the products with a high amount of radiation was distributed to the consumers. So for example, my place 270 miles away from Fukushima is a big tea producing area. And because there was a big news about the contamination of the tea from Shizuoka, a lot of the farmers voluntarily tested our own tea. But other tea producing area much closer to Fukushima, they have been very quiet and silent, and they didn't do any testing. But it's not just a fault of the farmers, because if we find high contamination in our tea, that will destroy the reputation of that area and lose the consumer. And without the compensation or enough compensation, we will lose our production and everything. So.
And how many times has a government official since 3/11 come to your 5-acre farm and actually performed any sort of monitoring on the amount of radiation in your soil?
Never.
Never. And how many of your neighboring farmers in your region have had visits from government officials?
I've never seen any.
And in the area that's closer, there have also been obviously very few, if any, visits from governmental agents.
You mean in Fukushima?
In the area of tea farming you discussed where you said they've been much more hush-hush about it, where they've really put a lid on it. It's only thanks to, let's say, the moral compass guiding each of these farmers, and the fact that a lady like you, your background, you lived in the Bay Area, correct? You went to Berkeley and your background was organic farming. Tell us a bit about that.
So I graduated UC Berkeley in 2003. I majored in sociology and psychology, and I returned farm to join my father, who started organic farming 36 years ago. And because I thought farming is a very essential part of our life and also very important to the society, because now the society is so far away from the nature, and there's a lot of crazy crimes happening, like murdering and of course going to the war, and people are forgetting the appreciation to the life. So to reconnect the people to the nature by farming, I thought it would be important. So that's why I decided to go back and farm 10 years ago.
Going to the war, in which war are you referring to?
I'm talking about the invasion in Iraq and Afghanistan. That's when I was a student here. That's all these things were happening.
And so you developed a bit of a sense of activism here in America?
Yes, you can say that.
That's awesome. Good for you. Now, how much of that activist spirit did you take back to your farming region in Japan?
Oh, a lot. I mean, after I returned, I am very much into organizing the farmers' movement and, of course, involved in the peace movement too, because right after I returned, the Japanese government wanted to change the peace constitution that prohibits the government to hold any military and send the military to a broad country. But by revising this constitution, they wanted to have the actual military. Right now, we only have the self-defense force, even though we have a lot of high military spending. But currently, the constitution doesn't allow the government to have the military and send the troops to abroad. But they want to act like the U.S. to invade Iraq and Afghanistan, join the U.S. force. So I was into the peace action too, to protect the constitution and not to send the military abroad.
Amazing. Well, God bless you for going back there. Now, I have a bit of a personal question for you. We've heard reports from Japan, quite a few of them, I'm afraid to say, of farmers being so emotionally devastated, so depleted from having the very fabric of the meaning of life itself ripped to shreds right under their feet. Farmers in your area, that there's actually been a miniature epidemic of suicides. Do you know any farmers who've experienced this or whose families have experienced this directly?
After March 11th, you mean?
Yes, after 3/11, there's been farmers who are so emotionally devastated because arguably the land that they're farming, they're more connected to it after multiple generations than they might even be to their own brothers and sisters. So for them to lose this is like the meaning of life itself being removed from underneath them. The question I actually had was, following up on that, do you know of any of those families who have gone through that kind of experience?
I know some members of Nominland, the National Farmers Organization, committed suicide. He was a cattle farmer in Fukushima, and he lost everything after the nuclear disaster, so he committed suicide, unfortunately.
And what sort of counseling, what sort of therapy, what sort of governmental guidance is available, if any, to these farmers whose very fabric of life has been ripped from underneath them?
First, just the nuclear power generation or nuclear energy cannot coexist with life and farming. That's first to be said. And this is not just the issue of the nuclear power plants, because there was already farmers' suicide before March 11th. Because of the devastated lives of the farmers, they couldn't make the sustainable living after farming. So many of them, of course, do not commit suicide, but they don't want their young generation to succeed their farm. that was a problem because even if they produce, since the market is not regulated, they do not make enough money to make the living. So that has to be fixed. And so it's not just, so in Japan we are having much broader discussion. Of course we are getting together to stop the nuclear power, but at the same time we are discussing about the broader issue, about the farmers' condition and of course consumption, about the imported food, about the environment, about the working condition of the young people and education and so on. So this has actually giving us a quite good opportunity to get together and talk about the broader issue in a network.
So you're saying that there were already farmers committing suicide before 311 because presumably they were practicing sustainable forms of agriculture, cottage level farming, shall we call it, non-mechanized big factory style farming. And so their livelihood was already under such dire threat that they were already committing suicide.
I mean, those farmers commit suicide or are devastated are not the organic farmers. Usually the farmers, the conventional farmers who have just trusted the government and also the agricultural cooperatives who promoted the use of chemicals and herbicides and chemical fertilizers. So they bought all this input, but they couldn't really sell their tea or sell their products. And of course, they do not have any power in the market to decide the price. So they are devastated, and some of them unfortunately commit suicide. But on the other hand, the organic farmers, they are more thriving actually because we have our own way of producing without depending on this expensive input from the produced by the companies. And we also, many of us also sell our products directly to the consumers, have more dialogue and communication with the consumer. So this has worked as a safety net even after March 11th. So many of the organic farmers, they are having much stronger relationship with the consumers.
It has actually strengthened the union of the organic farmers, and you're telling me it was the mainstream, what you call cooperative, but still what I'm going to call carbon farmer style mentality. And how big might one of those farmers be, these so-called co-op mainstream Japanese farmers who use chemicals and were already killing themselves because times were so tough for them? How big would one of those typical farms be?
You mean the representation among the entire farming population?
Yes, your average size farm, that these, the smaller ones presumably were the ones struggling to make it, or is that not the case? All of them, the whole Japanese farming community, the ones who were not practicing sustainable methods, were already, their livelihood was already, the whole industry was under siege already. So this 311 situation has simply compounded that then, surely.
So it is said that it is less than 1% of entire farming population that do the organic farming. And most of the farmers are using the chemicals in their farm. But what's different in Japan from the US or European or Western form of agriculture is that most of these farmers who use the chemicals are still the family farms, very small scale and bound to the community. So that's very different from here. We don't really see much of the industrialized farming like here, large scale. But it has been starting to be changed because many of the farmers, those small family farms, are giving up their land. So now it's giving more opportunity to the big farms to accumulate the land. And of course, the government now wants to change the agrarian land law that protects agrarian land only to the consumer, to the producers, and not to be transformed into commercial use or residential use. But the government wants to change this agrarian law, and of course want to promote the big companies or big group to accumulate the agricultural land. So now we are facing a big risk to change this sovereignty of the farmers to have access to the land and have rights to produce what they culturally produced from the long time ago.
Now, Ayumi, to switch gears for a minute, let's talk about the bigger picture with Japan's farming and this TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership. How is it going to affect people like yourself? I mean, this is beyond Fukushima. Isn't the TPP already years in the making? Wasn't it already in the making before Fukushima?
Yes, so before Fukushima, we were organizing a lot of rallies, and there was a lot of awareness that TPP, if is actually employed, it will completely destroy the Japanese agriculture. Currently, the self-sufficiency of Japan is 40%, which means we import 60% of the food from abroad. But if TPP happens, it will decline to 13%. And
13% self-sufficiency. And Obama actually wants TPP, and there's been scant, if any, media coverage. Most Americans have no idea what TPP means, and apparently the scope of this trade agreement is far beyond that of NAFTA's scale in the 90s, and that was one of the most talked about issue of the day. How much awareness and discussion is there in mainstream Japan, not just the small farmers in Japan, about the TPP?
so until March 11th, there was big awareness. Even those conservative agricultural cooperatives of Japan disagreed with the government. It never really happened in the history. In the past trade agreement, they always went along with the government policy. But this time, they realized how dangerous this policy can be. So they are now agreeing. And there was a big network of the different sectors and also different farmers' organizations joined together to oppose TPP. And now, after 1.5 years from March 11th, we are again starting to reform the group and also restart the discussion.
So your voices are actually being heard?
Yes, I think so, to the consumers too, because they are also a part of a discussion.
How many people in America have heard about the TPP?
I'm not sure.
I mean, when you bring it up, how many people respond in a manner that indicates that they're familiar with it?
None. Just one person I visited Food First today. So the person I talked to, of course, he's aware. But other than that, I asked many people in the U.S., but they are not really aware. And I don't think there's enough information and discussion in this country, how, in the individual level or in the grassroots level, how bad effects, influence it will have on the people's life.
And only 1% of your farming community practices organic and sustainable methods of farming?
That is what the research said.
And so presumably you've been a driving force locally in your community to, help instigate more sustainable, better methods of horticulture locally, am I correct?
Yes, I hope so. I also promote more young people who are not coming from the farming background to join us in our farmers movement in the local.
I mean, I heard about peaches recently being sold in Thailand that were, Geiger counters showing them right there in the supermarket going off the hook and, people proudly eating them and saying, well, these have been, validated by some mysterious agency, which clearly it doesn't sound like they have at all. What about fishermen? I mean, do you know much are you familiar with any of the fishing industry? Do you have any fishing family members?
No, I don't have any fishing family members, unfortunately, but I hear that there is not enough testing in the fish. Like, there's a lot of fish already in the market, but we do not know where the fish is coming from, actually. It just shows the port of the fish that was taken from, but it doesn't really say which area of the ocean the fish was actually caught. And of course, it doesn't really test all the samples. It's just like the farm products, but even worse in the fish industry.
We heard today clearly how you certainly, and the people who are listening to you, are starting to directly question the validity of an urban lifestyle, or for that matter, a suburban lifestyle. An extremely, carbon oil economy-based, a highly energy-based lifestyle. How many people in Japan are saying enough is enough? We're willing to sit down by a campfire, do without all of our electricity, all of our power needs, just to save the future generations?
I don't think not many people that completely deny the use of the electricity or the modern technology. But we are now discussing how can we live in the harmony with the nature, not so much destroying the nature, still using some amount of the electricity or the technologies. So we are trying to see the balance. How can we do this instead of having these nuclear power generations and instead of having all these crazy chemicals in our lives? So that is the discussion, the main discussion, and the most people who are participating in this kind of alternative searching is the young people, especially the women, because the young women are concerned about their children and concerned about their next generation. So it is a hope that those people who's never really been activists before are now just joining as an individual and just taking away all this like distinction between the organizations, and people are just getting together under the umbrella.
Breaking down a lot of bureaucratic barriers, right?
Yes.
Who else is doing anything about it besides these grassroots people, these direct delegates coming straight from the tea fields of Japan? Who else is actually doing anything about it?
You mean in the population?
Yes, in the general, in the government, in the military. I mean, it seems like the best work is all being done by volunteers. Going back to that earlier question, I was trying to ask you, these farmers whose lives are being just devastated, who's doing any counseling to them? Are there international volunteer, people with, who can actually do therapy and counseling for these people?
No, I don't see that, but people are just helping each other. So we are just having discussion from different sectors. People get together, and for example, there's evacuees from Fukushima prefecture to Shizuoka, to my hometown. So now the people in the local are welcoming them, or sometimes we host a weekend trip for the children in Fukushima to stay at least over the weekend in the clean area of Shizuoka to enjoy the outside and play outside and so on. So people are just helping each other. It's not really coming from above. That's what we learned. After March 11th, we cannot really depend on this like big companies or the establishment, including the government. We are so used to being provided, but after March 11th, we have learned to be just active, not just be independent.
Surely that must serve as a dramatic example, Ayumi, to America, where in the light of these big disasters we've been having the last few years and the questionable response levels by our government to help us, more and more it's becoming apparent. We're going to have to save ourselves from our own, government's inabilities to help us. We have to do exactly what you've been doing.
Yes, I think so. At the same time, you are working on the government too, because we cannot just be separated from the government, because they are the one who are making the big political or the decision making. So, for example, in our local too, we are collecting the signature to at least have a referendum in the local level to either stop or restart the nuclear power plants that exist. But unfortunately, that was rejected by the Congress of the prefecture. But at least we had a chance to voice our opinion as a citizen. So we continue to pressure the government from the grassroots.
So you tried to prevent them restarting it, but they went ahead and quashed that and restarted it anyways, even though your voice was heard.
No, they haven't restarted. But now they have to make some favorable comment to the people in the prefecture. Otherwise, they are not going to be re-elected. That's the kind of pressure they are receiving now. So they are making different comments. But still, there's a long way to go to change them.
Well, God bless you, Ayumi. I really appreciate your time. Thank you for coming and doing this with us here. We're looking forward to talking to you again in the very near future.
Thank you.